feel it? The energy's in the air. COP27 is just around the corner. Just in a few days, it's going to start. And this is probably going to be the most contentious, most interesting COP event that we've had so far. And part of the reason why is that the specifics of clean energy transition are now here. It's not something in the future like it was in COP21, where the homework assignment was essentially come up with a development strategy. Now we're in our 6th year after COP21. We last year saw a revision of the standard or the focus of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We saw an upward revision of that to 2.4 degrees Celsius. But now more and more countries have actually implemented development plans. They've actually implemented national policy frameworks around clean energy, around climate change. So now we have an opportunity to see where everybody is and where are the points of alignment around global policy to support those global goals of limitation of global temperature rise. Now, within that context, though, is a significant geopolitical shift that clean energy transition presents. Because I think the most important aspect of clean energy transition is that from an oil and gas perspective, you have a small set of dominant producers that essentially ran the entire market. Now we're seeing with clean energy, you have a number of different modalities of energy sources or generating sources, but within that you also have a much more varied range of commodity inputs that are required for that. And across those commodity inputs, you have a greater number of countries that are in the developing world that have dominant market share. So the leverage that a lot of these countries have is the greatest amount of leverage that they have probably ever experienced in their histories. And certainly as a whole, the global south right now has significantly more leverage over developed countries or mature economies than at any point since the colonial era started. And this new leverage will give developing countries in the global south a greater opportunity to put financial pressure on rich, mature economies to do things like compensate for economic damage that has come as a result of climate change, but more importantly, to drive further and greater levels of private investment into these areas. I think one of the big challenges that Africa in particular faces is a complete lack of private investment within the energy space, and has significant impact on the number of projects that can even move forward. And if you compare the level of private investment or private participation in deals across Africa with Europe or the United States, you can see that in the US it's something like 85% of all infrastructure projects have private investment. In Africa, that's 12%, and you can see the significant difference between the level of infrastructure that's available in both of those two areas. So those are going to be the three I would consider to be major talking points or points of contention within COP27 that's going to start in Egypt in just a few days. For this video, though, I want to explore a few concepts. So one is I'll explore one concept, which is just diving in comparatively with oil and gas production to clean energy inputs. And then we'll ask three questions. So the first question is, what are the primary inputs within clean energy? We'll look at how will different energy transition scenarios impact extraction intensity and processing intensity. And when we talk about transition scenarios, we're talking about the current set of stated policies versus the development goals that have been outlined by groups like the Congress of the Parties, or COP. And then the last question is, what are the emerging geopolitical patterns of this clean energy transition? So starting with that first comparative exploration, where we look at the top producing countries for oil and gas as well as clean energy. And you can see that for oil and gas, there's a very small set of countries. It's the United States, for oil at least, it's the United States, it's Saudi Arabia, and it's Russia in terms of the leading producing countries for oil. For natural gas, the leading countries are United States, Russia, and Iran. And in both cases, those top three producing countries produce more than 50% of that particular resource. 50% of oil, 50% of natural gas. Now we look comparatively at the key minerals for the various modalities of clean energy. You think about photovoltaic solar, concentrated solar power, hydrogen, lithium-ion batteries. The list goes on, right? There are a core set of materials that are common across all of these different modes of electricity generation, and we can see that there's a significantly more varied set of countries that make up the dominant producers of these resources. So, for example, with copper, you have Chile and Peru and China, which are the top three producers, and together they make slightly less than 60%, or produce less than 60% of the total copper across the planet. For nickel, you have Indonesia, you have Philippines, as two countries who combined have about 45 to 50% of total production of nickel. For cobalt, you have the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is producing almost 70% of the global cobalt supply. This list goes on as we see the range of additional minerals, rare earth metals, etc., that make up the value chain or the supply chain for clean energy. So when you have this different set of countries, again, the leverage is going to shift significantly as the demand for producing more of this grows over time. Now, I spoke first about extraction of natural gas as well as of oil, and extraction for all of these sets of minerals. The picture when we talk about processing is a very different one, and it's very interesting. And I'll preface this by first saying that when we look at fossil fuels, in particular oil and natural gas, you see that the United States is the largest producer of both, with just under 20% for oil for the United States and about a third of global natural gas coming from the United States. There's a particular reason when you think about the countries that are dominant oil producers, and you think about the geopolitical blocks that they form, right? You have the United States and Canada to a lesser extent. You also have some of the Nordic countries that are oil producing, like Norway, and then you also have OPEC. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the petrodollar, right, which is the arrangement by which oil-producing countries in OPEC only sell crude oil in dollars. So there's only one currency that they accept for purchases, right? That forces most countries in the world who are not net oil producers themselves to essentially have to hoard up and load up on US dollars in order to be able to buy oil. Right, so that creates an artificial demand for U.S. dollars. That essentially is what buttresses the U.S. dollar in its position as the global reserve currency. Right, but it's all made possible because of the fact that the United States itself is the major producer. Not only is it the major producer, though, but it's also the major oil refining country when we talk about the crude oil supply chain. So you have a country that is completely dominant in this one energy source, and there are not very many inputs, so it makes it easy to corner the market. And so that's what the United States has done, and that has been the foundation of American geopolitical power since the end of the Second World War and the establishment, essentially in the 70s, of moving up the gold standard and implementing the petrodollar at the same time. Now, when you look at this new world, where we do have especially one where we have a very aggressive clean energy transition, the United States, as you can see, no longer has a place in the preeminent sort of position of being able to call the shots on the supply chain or of the production. So this is true for both extraction as well as for processing of the materials. So this sort of second layer post-extraction, when you turn it into the semi-finished components before you actually move down the value chain to create the finished items, such as solar panels, for example, or wind turbines, etc. So this has some impact on the diplomacy that needs to happen going forward. The type of unilateral decision making in the financial world, or the use of organizations like the World Trade Organization to unilaterally make decisions, financial decisions that impact other countries, that is something that is going to be less and less of an available tool as a result of this shift. And I think the other fundamental aspect of this, or the reason why this is so important, is because all economies are essentially energy economies. Why is that? You cannot have any economic activity, at least in today's modern economy, without electricity or without some form of energy, even if it's not electricity, right? Before there was electricity, You had firewood, you had coal burning, you had steam power, etc., or even like windmill power or water mill power, for example. So it's the control of energy sources means you have control over economy. So that's why it's, from a geopolitical or diplomatic perspective, it's so important to the United States to have this level of control, and why the United States has been able to exert this level of power since the end of World War II across the entire world without some sort of wide-scale revolt. And it's essentially because of such crushing control over the predominant energy source for the entire world. But now that's shifting, right? Now we have a completely different picture when you look at clean energy transition. And in particular, not extraction, but in particular processing. You see the tremendous, almost overwhelming advantage that China has. And this is not something that has been true for a long time. In fact, if you go back 10 or 15 years, right, the top processing companies for, say, polysilicon, which is one of the key materials in photovoltaic solar cells, you can see that 15 years ago, the top producing countries were predominantly European countries. Whereas fast forward today, when you look at the top 10, it's 6 or 7 of the top 10 producers are Chinese. And if you look at it from a market share perspective in terms of the actual market cap, that advantage is even more stark. So that is going to be a point of concern, and that has been a point of concern, framed in many different ways. One of the ways that's been framed has been the concern trolling about Chinese investment across Africa and how it's it's colonialism 3.0. And this is all said without any sense of irony by Europeans or Americans. But go figure. But again, when we break this out beyond just processing and we look at the entire supply chain or the entire value chain, so it's not just about this like second layer processing post extraction, right? We look at battery materials, battery cell packs, the polysilicon production, the solar panel production, wind turbine production, all the way to the end use, right? The actual deployment of electric vehicles, the actual deployment of photovoltaic cells, the actual deployment of wind turbines. You see Chinese dominance, market dominance on all phases of the value chain and all phases of the supply chain, right? So that is a major, major shift in terms of the potential for global power. So while we do get distracted by the seeming impotence of Chinese response to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the seeming many YouTubers are gleefully exclaiming the end of China. I see a lot of videos of the Chinese economy is going to collapse in 30 days or in 25 days or in 45 days, right? There's a lot of sort of vultures circling with the current financial stress that the Chinese market is facing right now. But all of those things, I mean, the financial crisis was not existential to the United States, and neither was the Great Depression, right? I think that's important to recognize in the context. Yeah, like they're going through some very difficult times. Part of it is a result of their COVID management strategy, but at the end of the day, you still see the major advantage in energy markets that China has, and that is the source of Chinese power. It's not anything else. It really is the level of control that they have over all aspects of the value chain, right? That is going to be the foundation of Chinese state power over the next 50 years. And as much as we want to point to American exceptionalism and the nukes that the United States has, or the size of the US military, or the petrodollar, right? No empire lasts forever. There's always a crack that challenges empires, and how empires respond is what defines them and is what extends their lifespan. And right now, what we're seeing is not an existential challenge to American prosperity or American power by any means, because the United States by itself is resource rich enough to essentially be an isolated island by itself and an economy unto itself and completely uninvolved in global politics, and it'll still be probably the most comfortable place to live on the planet, even with all of that. What we're really talking about, though, is the ability to dictate the pace of world affairs and to control geopolitical events, right? That is the reason why the petrodollar was put into place, was that the United States wanted to have this level of control. China is looking to have that same level of control. What the purpose is for that level of control, it remains to be seen. It's not wholly clear, but certainly it does exist. So getting into the question about what are these inputs that we're talking about to clean energy in general, right? So I'll walk through a few of the major minerals and talk through their relationship with various clean energy sources. So, for example, we have copper, we have cobalt, nickel, lithium, rare earth materials, chromium, zinc, PGMs, aluminum. And so these are the primary inputs for across the board for clean energy sources. And the clean energy sources that we're most concerned about today, particularly from Asoba DeFi's perspective, are photovoltaic solar, lithium-ion batteries, electric vehicles, and in particular electricity networks, because you build all of these clean energy inputs, these sources of generation or of storage, but you still need transmission networks to be able to move electrons from the generating source to people that actually need to use this electricity. So all of those things are incredibly important when we think about this mix of the mineral needs for clean energy networks and so on. So one other thing we got to look at is, now that we're sort of clear about the clean energy inputs that we're talking about, who has market share or dominance across the value chain for any of these, is that we also want to look at what are the actual scenarios of clean energy implementation or the clean energy transition, particularly over the next 20 or so years, because most of the sustainable development goals that are developed by the UN and other groups, they're a look forward over the next 20 years, because I think it's much more difficult to plan beyond that. So we look at the next 20 years. There are a number of different scenarios that we account for when we think about the possible mineral extraction intensity that comes along with clean energy transition. So we start with sort of the current trajectory of what we're seeing. And then going forward, we can also look at two different distinct scenarios. So there's one scenario which is essentially the stated policies as they exist in countries around the world. What is the trajectory that we can anticipate with those stated policies? Now the second piece is what is that pace with our sustainable development goals? What does that look like when we have these goals that are much more aggressive in clean energy transition? And we can see that from a solar perspective, we can anticipate with sustainable development goals, we can anticipate a tripling of the total amount of photovoltaic solar that is deployed across the world, with China leading the way, in particular with the actual deployment, but India following close behind. And again, these are two huge countries that have large rural populations that still need to be electrified. So they are at the front of the line in terms of the level of urgency in which they're pushing. So that's one area where they will be moving in lockstep with the West in terms of, yes, we are happy to make sure that there's financing and funding available to actually put all of these new energy generating points online. But unlike the West, they are not going to be picky about, no, we can't do coal, we only can do this. They want it all, because they have, between them close to 4 billion, maybe that's a little exaggeration, maybe 3.5 billion between them, population-wise, that they have to serve, and they have to serve at a level of service that is consistent and reliable. Now, in addition to this level of photovoltaic solar that is going to be implemented, or that is target implementation, there's also a level of grid expansion that also needs to accompany that, right? When you build many more solar plants, yes, some of it's going to be on site, but most of the megawatts or most of the gigawatts that are built are going to be utility scale, which means there's going to be a huge solar farm sitting somewhere out, in the country, and you need to wire it, and you need to set up your distribution, so your substation, your transmission, and your distribution all needs to be set up. So that requires an incredible amount of copper in order to be able to actually put into place. But in addition to the expansion of new transmission capacity, you also have the replacement of existing transmission capacity. So both of those go hand in hand, right? There's going to be a lot more expansion than there's going to be replacement, but there still needs to be both in order to meet the actual energy demand and the ability to supply that demand at the level that is expected by the population. Now, from a mineral perspective, all right, so we talk about the actual pace of development. We talk about the sort of ancillary grid expansion that needs to happen to support that. Now, there's also the mineral demand that accompanies that, and the level of mineral demand is expected to also grow substantially, about alongside the growth of photovoltaic in general, in terms of 3x growth, that's about the level in terms of kilotons of mineral demand that's also expected to grow. It's going to be about 3x in these sustainable development scenario. And again, that sustainable development scenario is the scenario where we target less than 2 degrees Celsius of global temperature increase over the next 50 years. So again, very, very aggressive goal. We also see a similar type of growth trajectory with electric vehicles as well as lithium-ion batteries. Although you actually see a more marked increase with a roughly 10x increase in the number of expected EVs, as well as the increase in the total amount of gigawatt capacity storage for lithium-ion batteries. So again, with the Sustainable Development Goal trajectory, we see a very aggressive, steep curve of increase of adoption of these materials, rare earth materials, etc. That, like I said before, gives us a significant amount of leverage to developing countries as we move forward in this clean energy transition. Now, what does this mean, though, from a broad geopolitical perspective? How is this going to play itself out? And I see a couple of different scenarios. Now, there's one scenario where we see an increased level of volatility in these commodity prices, which will give us much more systemic volatility. But at the same time, even though there may be greater levels of systemic volatility because we see volatility, there are more inputs that are required, we can also see the potential for actually decreased volatility because there's a much longer lead time between the production of, or the extraction, and then the final production of inputs when in a clean energy scenario versus a crude oil scenario, where crude oil takes a long time to develop the oil fields, to actually drill, etc. But once you are, the actual material is used up very quickly. And so price volatility is felt much faster in the supply chain perspective. So you may see greater insulation from volatility, but when volatility does hit as a result of impacted supply, it may be more meaningful. Now, with that being said, a number of countries that are developing countries that do have significant market advantage within these particular types of materials are also at high risk of climate change. So the ability to even extract or explore and develop these resources for extraction may be heavily impacted by climate change. And this is not true just for global south countries. Even for places like Australia and the United States, the big areas for solar production, etc. Australia is the world's largest lithium extractor and exporter. You also see significant risk of drought as well as wildfires, which have a major limiting impact on the ability to exploit these resources for production. So you can imagine if the world's largest lithium producer, 50% of the world's lithium produced in Australia, you see significant outages as a result of wildfires, right? That is a massive impact on that trajectory of development goals that we're targeting, which are very aggressive. 10xing over 20 years the number of electric vehicles on the road and the batteries that support them. So there are a number of geopolitical issues that we can kind of trace and assess the impact from an economics perspective and from a finance perspective. I think the one big one, lastly, that I'll leave you with is the competition that the United States is facing with China, particularly in Africa, with regards to the actual investing and development of these resources. China, through its One Belt One Road initiative, has made a strong investment in building diplomacy and investment through diplomacy to ensure that it has continuous supply of the resources it needs for its own energy development within its own country. The United States, the needs are much less about American consumption and much more about its desire to maintain its current position as sort of the financial, military, global hegemon. And the requirement to maintain that, given that Africa has been quite an afterthought in both the Trump as well as the Obama administration, is that Biden is going to have to make some significant inroads to make up for the advantage that the United States has lost as a result of being asleep at the wheel with regards to investment. But again, it's not just China that the United States is contending with, because oil countries such as Saudi Arabia, the Emirate states, and other Gulf states are also eyeing investments in Africa as a way to diversify and be able to profit from the clean energy transition, because their own cash cow they're recognizing is something that is of limited supply at this point. So they're leveraging the financial flexibility at the moment that they have it to be able to get in and make key infrastructure investments in Africa so that they can maintain a financial position in the clean energy transition. So there's going to be, I think, a pretty significant financial bonanza that is going to happen across Africa over the next decade or so. It's going to be led, as it currently is, by China as well as the Middle East investing in large projects. But I think that the United States has a significant opportunity to support the growth of small business proliferation, particularly with solar development. And I'm not saying that because I'm biased, but again, I have a front row seat in that particular space, and I think that that is an area where the United States can make some substantial inroads. It can take advantage of the currency strength that the dollar has relative to other currencies to, in some capacity, make up for the lost decade of essentially moving extremely slowly, taking 3 years to deploy capital for a project while China takes 6 months, right? No exaggeration. To make up for that advantage, to reposition itself as a primary partner for African countries. But again, it's a Red Queen race. It really comes down to whoever can secure those supply chains, whoever can develop those resources to move forward. That's where African countries are going to go with regards to who they choose to partner with, what capital they choose to accept, and everything else moving forward. So anyway, those are my takes on some of the key issues of COP27, particularly with regards to the clean energy transition and the commodity market underpinning that whole space. So there'll be some interesting conversations at COP27, and we'll see if I'm right about some of these predictions around how the conversations are going to go. But in any case, hope you like this video. If you do like this video, please like and subscribe. We have a lot more videos with the SOBA DeFi on this subject of commodity markets within energy, capital markets within energy, as well as the actual technicals of actual development of photovoltaic solar across Africa. This is a very exciting space, and we hope that you're excited about this too.